Okay, so I want to share my screen with you and just kind of go over. I'm gonna have to make a hard stop at 10:40 because I have a class in high school. So I just want to share with you kind of where we are now. We are on November 18th. So we're going to try to finish up the Sephardic section today. And next week we're going to, well, yeah, not next week, but the week after we're going to do Ethiopian Jewry and then Yemenite Jewry. And then we're going to tie it together. That's our plan. So we're finishing up the Sephardic piece. The Sephardic spirituality took actually 3 weeks, a little bit more, because there's a lot of Sephardim. And also I know a little bit more about that than the other topics. Okay, so let's get going. Let's pick up where we left off. We have a bunch to do today. We finished Sephardim Mizrachim. We finished spirituality and culture. Now we are, actually just leave this open a little bit so I can see some faces. Okay, now we are in halacha and custom. Okay, we kind of left off here last time. We talked about a few of the customs. Way to remember the matzahs, yum, carbs, and we talked about the names last time. So what I want to do is I want to take a step back, talk a little bit about halachic process, Sephardic halachic process. Okay, this, just so you understand, we talked about how Sephardic halacha sometimes is more lenient. Those who don't go according to Jewish mysticism. Why is that? I want to show you the thought process of Sephardic poskim, halachic decisors, and how they arrive at the bottom line law. This will be like 3 to 4 minutes, some halacha. Just kind of try to pay attention. This will help you. If this is like a chart I made in like 3 minutes a while ago, but it's a good chart. So let's start from here, I guess. So in the there's this top line here. You see, they have Rav Alfasi, Rambam, and Rabbeinu Asher. Okay, they're considered Rishonim. Okay, so we have. Let me just find my Talmud. Okay, so the Talmud is a text that was written in the beginning of the first millennium. Okay, it's put down. Later authorities in like 11th century, 12th century, etc., they wrote commentary on the Talmud. Now, Rabbi Yosef Karo in the middle, that's the middle circle here. Rabbi Yosef Karo in 1488 to 1575, he said, how do I know what the law is? There are so many commentaries. We have Rav Alfasi, we have Rambam, Rabbeinu Asher, Rashbam, there's many other, Ramban, there's many Rishonim who comment on the Gemara. How do I know how to establish the law? There are so many of them, and they're all really important and special. And this is kind of like what he said here. This is our halacha. I'm just going to go here again. Our halacha, the Shulchan Aruch was written by this middle circle, Rabbeinu Yosef Karo. Okay, he's also called the Beit Yosef because his name's Yosef, and he named his book the Beit Yosef. Now he lived in Tzfat, Israel. He wrote the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch is basically him trying to establish the law based on all of the commentaries he saw on the Rishonim, which is the upper layer here, Rambam, Rav Alfasi, etc. So he said, how do I decide who the law is like? And this was what he said. This is kind of what he wrote to himself. He said, I originally thought, after quoting and explaining all these sources, I would then make the final halachic ruling and would decide between the various opinions. For this should be the final result, one Torah with one set of laws. I have so many commentaries. How do I set the halacha? I saw, however, that if we were to decide between the poskim on the basis of legal arguments and proofs deduced from the Talmud, though there exists a wealth of legal arguments. Balei Tosfos, Chidushei Rambam, Rashba, Ran, each supporting various opinions. So I'm going to skip now to this middle paragraph here. I'll just move in a little bit. I therefore decided, I'm sorry. Move this other window a little bit to the side. I've therefore decided that since there exists 3 pillars of halachic guidance, this is very important, okay? This, if you just get this from this class in terms of the halachic process, you've understood something and you know how the halacha works. I therefore decided that since there exists 3 pillars of halachic guidance upon which the house of Israel rests, this is the introduction of Rabbi Yosef Karo to his book. The Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh, it only makes sense that where 2 of them agree, we should rule accordingly. Okay, and then he goes on to bring different exceptions. So I want to show you what that means. Show you what that means. So that means that anytime Rabbi Yosef Karo basically took all the other Rishonim out of the equation for the most part, if these three Rishonim express their opinion, Rav Alfasi, Rambam, and Rabbeinu Asher. Now pay close attention. Where are they from? Rambam or Rabbeinu Alfasi are, at least them, are from Sephardic areas, and also Rabbeinu Asher. Rabbeinu Asher is influenced by Ashkenazi, by Tosfos, etc. But Rabbeinu Yosef Karo happened to choose Rishonim to establish the halacha by who had a Sephardic tradition. So whenever there were 2 out of 3 to decide a certain way, he would go by them. This raised the eyebrows of Ashkenazi poskim. They said, how do you establish the law based on the majority of Sephardic rabbis? So they brought in their own commentaries, and they disagreed with this structure. But for Sephardic halacha, this is how it goes. Rav Alfasi, Rambam, Rabbeinu Asher, if 2 out of 3 agree, that's the law. And that's basically how Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote the Shulchan Aruch. That's why it's not very, Sephardic halacha sometimes isn't very complicated. It's pretty simple. You go 2 out of 3, and when that happens, even if it's lenient, we go by their analysis. Now, if you go a little bit down on this chart, there are 2 streams within Sephardic halacha, and this is going to bring us to the last part of this class today. One is, if you go on the right side of this chart, is based on the Shulchan Aruch. Rav Ovadia Yosef, on the bottom of the page, on the bottom of this chart, it says, 1920, 2013, he follows the Shulchan Aruch, and that's why his law is pretty lenient and easy to follow. On the left side, there's a strand within Sephardic halacha that goes by mysticism, that kind of sways a little bit from the Rabbi Yosef Karo method, and they incorporate more Ashkenazic halacha, they incorporate Jewish mysticism. And the postek that followed, that was the postek that really pushed that forward, was the Ben Ish Chai, 1835-1909. And then Rav Mordechai Eliyahu was in our generation, he kind of also expounded upon that and promoted it. So basically what you have, and I'm just going to summarize, okay? You have 3 main Rishonim in the upper layer. Rabbi Yosef Karo saw that those are the main figures. He said, whenever they agree 2 out of 3, I'll follow their halacha. That was Rabbi Yosef Karo. That's how he wrote the Shulchan Aruch. The Ashkenazi, the Ramah and the Ashkenazim felt uncomfortable with that because the majority is Sephardi here in this count. And Rabbeinu Asher followed more Ashkenazic direction, but Rambam and Rav Alfasi were clearly Sephardic. Felt uncomfortable with that, so they brought in other explanations, other commentaries, other halachic rulings, and based on their those opinions, they established the law, which sometimes is more stringent, more difficult to follow. Now, in terms of later generations, Rav Ovadia Yosef followed he claims that he's following the direction of Rabbi Yosef Karo, and therefore his halacha is pretty straightforward and also lenient a lot of the times. The other side of Sephardic halacha is Rabbeinu Yosef Chaim, the Ben Ish Chai, and Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, if they incorporate mysticism and more of the Ashkenazi halacha. So if you ask, how did the Sephardic halacha get more lenient? It's basically because it's more simplified. It's more simplified, 2 out of 3, and then you just follow the Shulchan Aruch. So I hope that was that's a lot in a little bit of time, but I just want to show you the texts that work with this. So this is, let me just show you. Here's the Shulchan Aruch. This is Rabbi Yosef Karo. Here's what this is what the Shulchan Aruch looks like. This is him in the 15th century, he put this together, 16th century. And here's what a page of the Shulchan Aruch looks like. So up here, it says Halacha Hey, for instance, Mishi Yeshlo Shtei Tinokot Lamul. So if someone has 2 children to circumcise, all around the different sides of the Shulchan Aruch, on the right and the left, is commentary. It's called super commentary. So Rabbi Yosef Karo put together Shulchan Aruch, again, based on those three Rishonim. And then we had the later authorities. On the left is Rav Ovadia Yosef and his son, Rav Yitzchak Yosef, who's the chief rabbi of Israel, and their halachic book, which is called the Yakut Yosef. This is following the more straightforward approach of Rabbi Yosef Karo. And on the right, this is the book of the Ben Ish Chai, the Jewish mysticism, based more on Jewish mysticism and some halachic, Ashkenazic halachic stringencies. And that's the Ben Ish Chai, and that's Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, his follower. So that's kind of like in general, the general structure of the halachic process for Sephardim. And in Sephardic, in yeshivas, basically what we learn is like this discussion. This is the Beit Yosef's in here, and he kind of brings, in these texts here, he brings the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh, and all the other Rishonim, and he tries to establish the halacha. So it's kind of like what people do in yeshiva. They study the Rishonim, the higher strand, and then the practical halacha. I hope that was helpful. I know it kind of like went through it really quickly. Let me know. Can you let me know in the chat section if you have any questions, if that was helpful? I kind of went through it quickly. Which is the more dominant Sephardi approach? Okay, that's a great question. So the more dominant Sephardi approach is Rav Ovadia Yosef. Rav Ovadia Yosef is the more dominant Sephardi approach. Why? Rav Ovadia Yosef, first of all, we're going to talk about this at the end of our class. Rav Ovadia Yosef is more lenient and easy to follow. And that already finds favor among the masses. Also, he was a much greater political leader than Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, and that gained him a lot of acceptance among all of Am Yisrael. I'll just fast forward to our slide with him. Take a look at his funeral. Okay, that's Rav Ovadia Yosef's funeral. Okay, this is only a little bit of the people. I think it was the biggest funeral ever in Israel. 1 million people were there. You know, they had like the mega million march, and that was really only like a few hundred thousand. I don't know, some thousand. This is actually 1 million people were at that funeral. So Rav Ovadia Yosef is the predominant approach, and it's more lenient and it's easier to follow. So that's kind of like just in terms of the process. Okay, so let's move on to, if there are any questions, please add them in the chat section. I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment and just see how people are doing. Give me 1 second. 1 second. Let me just try to see how everyone's doing. All right, give me a thumbs up if you're doing okay, if you're following us so far. Okay, cool. Okay, cool. Let's move on. All right, so there's here, we talked a little bit about this last time. What I want to do is I still want to get through custom Sephardic women, which many have raised that, like what's the place of women within Sephardic culture and Jewish law. And then I want to also get finally to Rav Ovadia Yosef. There's a lot of good tidbits and information connected to him. So let's move on to halacha and custom. We talked about the process. Here are some customs. I'm not going to go too deep into this. I just want to talk about one of them. We talked about names last week, how Sephardim will name the child after a grandfather in the grandfather's life. Here are some differences. We talked about this last week, but I just want to go into one of them today. We'll talk about kitniyot today. One more I want to talk about is candle lighting on Friday night. Okay, so for when Ashkenazic practice is when you light the candle, you light them first. One closes one's eyes, and then makes the blessing, and then does this gesture. That is a little different than how we usually make blessings. Usually make a blessing before you do the action. Well, for Ashkenazim, they accept the Sabbath through lighting the candles. So they don't want to make the blessing and accept the Sabbath with the blessing, and then light the candles. They'll be desecrating the Sabbath. So what do? Is they light the candles first. They close their eyes. They make the blessing, and they've accepted the Sabbath with the blessing. And then they'll do this gesture where they're basically covering the candles. That's basically the origin of it. And so they'll have an action after their blessing. Because you always have to have an action after you make the blessing, like over fruit. Make a blessing over the fruit, then you eat the fruit. Same here. You make the blessing over the fire, over the candles, then you cover them, then you expose them and you see them and you benefit from them for the first time. So that's the action that follows the blessing for in the Ashkenazic practice. Now, for Sephardic practice, they don't do all that. They don't do this whole thing. I mean, maybe some do, but they don't have to because they don't accept the Sabbath with the lighting of the candles. So they'll make Baruch Atah Hashem, then they'll light the candle right after the blessing. They don't have to do all that. So that's like a little bit different, but it stems from the fact that for Ashkenazic practice, they accept the Sabbath with the blessing over the candles. So that's where the whole gesture comes into play. So I want to share with you just a little bit on kitniot. So here are some kitniot. So how did this difference between kitniot for Sephardim and Ashkenazim come into play when it comes to Pesach? So on Pesach, this is off limits for Ashkenazim, those who follow that custom, which is the Orthodox world. There has not been changes were made to that. In the conservative world, there has been changes made to that. But for Sephardim, they never accepted this custom. So what's the origin of it? So what's the origin of it? Just in a moment, just like in like one short moment, we'll talk about this. So here, just on the bottom here, some Rishonim were stringent. Okay, so it all starts from the Smak. He's a Rishon, and he says, regarding kitniot such as rice and beans, our rabbis had the practice not to eat them on Pesach. The reason is because of an edict to prevent violation of Torah law. Since kitniot are cooked in a manner similar to the way that grains are cooked. Had we permitted kitniot, one could easily have become confused because they are cooked similarly. In addition, in many locales, kitniot are made into bread, and people who are not well-versed in Torah laws might become confused. So basically, one reason for kitniot, the prohibition against kitniot, is because people confuse their cooking process with the 5 grains, or some of these kitniot are made into bread, and people will confuse the eating of them with bread. Now, you can ask yourself, well, today there's these amazing cakes out there. Well, we don't want to make Passover even harder, so those are permitted if they're made from non-kitniot. But based on this reason, maybe those should be forbidden too, but don't tell anybody. You don't want to give anybody ideas. Okay, the last reason that's brought, and this is the Beit Yosef, it says kitniot become mixed with grains which have the ability to become chametz. Okay, so these kitniot sometimes are found in certain barrels with other grains, or the opposite. The 5 grains sometimes are found in these barrels, so they forbade all of them due to that risk that you might end up eating chametz that got mixed into one of these barrels. So those are the 2 reasons for kitniot. But in Sephardic communities, this just was never accepted. So in a Sephardic household, you have hummus, you have rice, you have beans on Passover. It's much easier. So when people ask me, Rabbi, some reasons Jewish vegans find their way to me. So they ask, Rabbi, I'm vegan. What do I eat on Passover? The first thing I'll ask is, are you Sephardic or Ashkenazic? If you're Sephardic, you made my life easier. If it's Ashkenazic, then it's more difficult. You have to kind of figure out. I mean, many have pushed me to allow them to eat kitniot if they're vegan because they're like, what am I going to eat? But I'm actually not so comfortable doing that just because it's a custom that's been entrenched. It's not so simple to stop doing it. So there are supplements that people can eat, and people have written about it. Even Mein Bialik, who was from the Big Bang Theory, she wrote an article on what to eat as a vegan on Passover, as an Ashkenazic vegan. Okay, so let's get back to our slideshow here. So that's just a little bit on that. Let's see if there's anything else here that's worth touching upon. Wigs versus head coverings. We talked about most of these. It's interesting to note that for Sephardim, the mezuzah is aligned vertically. For Ashkenazim, it's horizontally. And really that goes back to a debate among the Rishonim of how you're supposed to actually put up a mezuzah. Rashi says you should put it straight. And I guess Rabbi Tam says you should put it vertically. And so Sephardim follow Rashi, and their mezuzah is straight. Also, their Sefer Torah is straight. It's a sign of honor to have the Sefer Torah stand up. And for the other opinion that says vertically, no one follows that. Basically, the Ashkenazic practice follows a compromise between those 2 views, and therefore it's on a slant. And their view basically says, like when you're in synagogue and the Torah is on the table, it's like spread out. Then you could sit down, but if it's standing up, you have to stand up the whole time. So if we leave the mezuzah and the Torah standing up, then it won't be respectful for us to be sitting down and living our normal lives in that kind of reality. So for Sephardim, their Sefer Torahs actually stand up, and their mezuzahs do too. For Ashkenazim, their Sefer Torahs are, as we know, laid out, and the mezuzahs are horizontal. Okay, so let's move on to Sephardic women. Okay, here's a Sephardic woman. Who's that Sephardic woman? That's my grandmother, my Savta, of blessed memory from my father's side. Now, who's she with? She is with a Sephardic man. Okay, who is he? That's Rav Ben Sion Shaul Zatzal. He's one of the bigger rabbis of the previous generation. We have familial connections. What's the connection? I share this with you. They're brother and sister. She was his oldest sister. Okay, so whenever we used to go to Israel, we used to get blessings from him. And I actually honestly believe, people ask me, like, how did you become so observant? You know, you didn't really grow up observant. I really believe that he prayed for me, and every summer I got blessings from him. And my grandmother prayed for me. I believe that helped me a lot to kind of find my path. So why am I bringing this? Aside from the fact that I wanted to endear myself more to you. No, just joking. Aside from the fact that that's important to know about this rabbi. My Savta, they talk about Sephardic women. So my Savta followed kind of like the gender roles. She didn't stand out. She didn't try to change the halacha, but she was one of the strongest women I know. That's kind of one piece I would say about Sephardic women. If you get to know Sephardic women, they are strong women. They're not always like looking, at least traditional ones are not looking to change halacha per se, or to have aliyah to the Torah. But they take a lot of pride in what they're doing. My Savta used to go to Rav Ben Sion Shaul's his house after his wife passed away. Every Thursday, she would finish up all her cooking at her house for her family on Thursday. She'd go to his house every Friday and cook for him all Friday for his whole family. And for her, that was her way of serving Hashem. And she did it with all of her heart and all of her soul. And that's kind of what you find, is that the Sephardic women that I've come across in different communities found them to be very strong, very passionate, and also very committed and devoted, even if they didn't always find themselves on equal footing in terms of all the obligations. Now, if that means it's equal or not, that's another story. But I'm just saying, in terms of the obligations, they might have less obligations, but they found ways to serve Hashem, like I share with you also. And I have I don't know if anybody saw my video. I once made a video of my Savta's Tehillim. She read Tehillim for an hour every Shabbos, and I have the Tehillim. I'll link the video, let you see that. I shared it once at Dvar Torah connected to that. So I would say, like, Sephardic women are strong. They find their ways to serve Hashem, and there's few aspects within Jewish law also that also make space for Sephardic women that weren't even kind of like that didn't find their place in the Ashkenazic world. So here's one. We have the Simchat Bat. Okay, the Sephardic community, it's called Zevet Habat. Sorry, Zevet Habat. So they had like a baby naming ceremony already before naming ceremonies became popular. And actually, if you open up Rabbi Sachs's Siddur, he has a Zevet Habat in his Siddur, and it's named after the Sephardic custom of the Zevet Habat. And basically, you read apart from Song of Songs, you make a gomel, you name the baby. And so that's something that was already all the time in Sephardic communities, in many Sephardic communities. Another area which is worth noting is Rav Uziel was one of the chief rabbis of Israel. I'm not going to go through all this, but he has the opinion that when it came to women voting, Rav Kook was an Ashkenazic chief rabbi. He said women at that time, it was a long time ago, he said he was against women, and everybody knows I love Rav Kook. This is not something I love about his teaching, but he said women shouldn't have the right to vote at that time. I'm sure if maybe he was around today, I'm sure he'd say different. But Rav Uziel was a Sephardic rabbi, and he brought some really simple arguments. And sometimes you find this in the Sephardic culture, which I mentioned before, is like this kind of like easygoing, open, simple thinking when it comes to halacha, and also when it comes to this case of women's voting. So he says, Women should, to this, I'm reading this paragraph here. Some opponents, up here at the top paragraph. To this, Rav Uziel stated there were many men with, some opponents found rabbinic sources indicating that women's understanding was limited. Therefore, they reasoned women should not be allowed to vote. To this, Rabbi Uziel stated that there were many men with limited understanding. Should they too be deprived of the right to vote? Moreover, Rabbi Uziel indicated that women were endowed with intelligence and sound judgment, no less than men. Simply looking at the actual situation today would prove that women were quite capable and competent to vote. And that's what he said. That's what he poskined. So this is like a few examples of how women found their place, like within the Sephardic community, and how they. I think my grandmother, for me, is a good example of a woman within the Sephardic community carving out her place, finding what she believes in, and living it passionately, and feeling empowered through that. And there's a few, and those two other customs was also show like a difference between Ashkenazic and Sephardic approaches when it comes to women from birth through later on in life. There's a lot more to say on this. I Googled like Sephardic feminism, and surprisingly, there wasn't a lot on that. but that could be just because like the movement of feminism is a Western movement more. Not saying that Sephardic women don't believe in the importance of femininity, but this idea femininity really, but the idea of movements and defining, and we talked about that, is more like a Western way of reflecting upon oneself and defining oneself in a certain way. So that also could be a reason why it hasn't really brushed through the Sephardic community. But I know Sephardic women now are dealing with this a lot, and I'd be curious to read more about that, which I haven't. So that's where I am with that for now. Let's move. Any questions at this point? Just you can feel free to put them in the chat section before I move on to this last section. Okay, let's get going. Last section. All right, Rav Ovadia Yosef. All right, I'm excited to teach about this. Now, what does Rav Ovadia Yosef mean to me? So Rav Ovadia Yosef was my grandfather's rabbi, my Saba's rabbi. My Saba learned with him. He sat at his feet and drank in his words of Torah with thirst, as the Mishnah and Avot says. My Saba also. So remember we talked about over here. Rav Mordechai Eliyahu. So here's a quick story. So my Saba knew Rav Mordechai Eliyahu. This is one of the chief rabbis of Israel. He knew Rav Mordechai Eliyahu from when he was a kid. Rav Mordechai Eliyahu passed away, so did my Saba. But my Saba used to give sermons like I do, maybe a little bit more, even more impassioned than me. They said he was a very passionate sermonizer in synagogue. And Rav Mordechai Eliyahu used to go to his sermons and listen to them. And my Saba told me this. And so one day I went to Rav Mordechai Eliyahu to get a blessing. And I said, I'm Yeshayahu Babayov's grandson. He goes, Ata Neched, you're the grandson of Yeshayahu Babayov. So that was like a very special moment for me, because he's a huge rabbi. If you know about those rabbis, like everybody in Israel used to go to them to get blessings. And so it was an honor for me to know that my Saba had a connection. My Saba also had a connection with Rav Ovadia Yosef. He learned with him. So let's talk a little bit about Rav Ovadia Yosef on a few different axes. Let's talk about him in terms of his biography, Rabbi of the Masses, as a brave posek and a political leader. So here's a little bit on his biography. He was born in Baghdad. In an early age, he moved to Israel. There's a story that people say that as a young man, he was as a young boy. That's him on the left there. He was a prodigy. Like Rav Ovadia Yosef was a prodigy, very unique mind. Shimon Peres had a really great connection with him. And he would like ask him questions on Judaism. He had a photographic memory, and it already started from an early age. So his Rosh Yeshiva, the head of his yeshiva, recognized that Rav Ovadia Yosef was going to be the next genius of the generation. Problem was, their family was living in dire straits. They were living in poverty. So his father needed him to work in his store. I guess they had a grocery store or something like that. So he needed a little young Ovadia to work with him. So he had to leave yeshiva like around 9, 10 or something like that, and work in the store. Now his Rebbe of Ezratia knew that Rav Ovadia Yosef was going to be the next gadol. So he said, he went to the store. He says, "Where's Rav Ovadia Yosef? I didn't see him in school today." And his father said, "Well, we need him for the business." He goes, "Listen, how much time do you need him every day? If you need him for 2 hours, I'll roll up my sleeves and I'll work for you in your grocery store. This is a story. It's like a legend. I'll work for you in your grocery store for those hours. Let the boy learn." And eventually, his father ended up like finding a way to allow for Rav Ovadia Yosef to learn. I also heard a story. It says that Rav Ovadia Yosef like wasn't the best clerk. So like people, there's like a bunch of like a few kids who would come in and steal things, and Rav Ovadia Yosef didn't catch it. And so his father, after a while, was like, "This boy, he's a great student, but he's not the best clerk." So maybe a combination of things allowed his father to enable him to continue to study. And so he went back to yeshiva and continued studying. Now he became a rabbi at age 20. He became a judge. At age 27, he took his first role as a rabbi in Cairo. And at age 33 already, he wrote this text. Okay, and for this text, he won the Israel Prize at age 50. So this is just one of them. Okay, now this is just one of the volumes. Okay, now try to read this. Okay, I know you can't read it over Zoom, but this is before Google. Okay, Rav Ovadia, this is before all the search engines. Rav Ovadia Yosef had everything in his head. So he had thousands of questions that were asked to him, and he wrote tshuvas, responsa, on the topics. This is Yepia Omer. So he put out his first volume at age 30, at age 33. And what were you doing at age 33? I don't know, but I don't know what I was doing. Rav Ovadia Yosef was writing these amazing texts. At age 48, he became the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, and at age 53, the chief rabbi of Israel. And in his 50s, you might ask, in his 50s, he had an eye ailment that some say almost went blind from it. And so due to that, the rest of his life, he wore these sunglasses, which kind of like, when you see him, you know who he is. Like kids know who Rav Ovadia Yosef is from the whole get up and the sunglasses and the outfit. So, but he didn't wear the sunglasses for the look. Sometimes you see like celebrities wearing sunglasses because they're hungover. That wasn't the case. He had some sort of eye issue, but he still was able to learn till the end of his days. Now, at age 64, after he finished working as the chief rabbi of Israel, there were some complications with them, and he wanted to apparently continue with being a chief rabbi of Israel for many years, but they changed the law where he could only serve for 10 years. I think, and apparently he was like hurt by that, and then he had a stage where he was kind of in solitude, but eventually emerged from that, and he went on to the next stage of his career, which was to be the head of a political movement in Israel. Okay, the political movement was called Shas. Okay, now look at this. This is after, I think it's after he passed away. It says Abba Mistakel Milamala. So Shas is a political party in Israel. It stands for Shomer Sfaradim, Shomrei Sfaradim, I think, and meaning it's the guardians of the Sfaradim. Okay, so he came on the political scene with that political movement in 1984, which is when he was 64, and he didn't like start the movement, but they brought him in as the spiritual leader, and that's how he gained great popularity. When they first got on the scene, they were worried they wouldn't get any mandates in the government. It turns out that they received 4 mandates to start with, and in 1984. In 1999, and I remember this, in 1999, they had 17 out of 120. That's pretty powerful. And it was led by Rav Ovadia Yosef. So that's how he also kind of became more popular in Israel. People got to know him. Now, what was unique, what their purpose of Shas was to take care of the Sfaradim, to restore the honor of the Sfaradim in Israel. And he succeeded in that. I said that so many times that I forgot what I was going to say. But that was the goal of the goal of that group. And in order to establish that, he didn't really take political stances. So he didn't like join governments. If anyone knows how the politics work in Israel, I'm sure you've learned this with Phil and also through your many years. He didn't join based on ideology. He knew his main goal was to take care of the Sephardic community and to help them with their education and get them money for their learning. And so he would basically join any government unless it was completely against everything he thought. So he was in a Rabin's government during the Oslo Accords. He didn't vote, but he didn't vote against it. And through their non-vote, the Oslo Accords were able to go through. So he wasn't necessarily right or left in terms of in politics. He was more involved with social issues, taking care of the Sephardim and building them up so they have a voice. And when he first came on the scene, the Sephardim really didn't have a voice in politics, and he really carved out a niche for the Sephardim with the Shas movement. Now let's talk a little bit about some other piece about his halacha, which also makes him unique. Here's the Pras Israel Prize that he won. Here's a picture. One second. Oops. Here we go. Here's a picture. This is a kind of like a charged picture, but this is a picture which I saw being used on a site which talks about the Aguna crisis. And Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was very involved with the Aguna situation in a certain context. So I want to talk about some of his halacha. And he was a brave posek. We talked about him as a political leader. Let me mention one more thing about him being the rabbi of the masses. So every Saturday night he had a class where he would tell jokes, and many thousands of people would tune into his Saturday night class, Motzei Shabbos classes, and that kind of endeared him to people. However, and another side to this. Often he would make jokes, and sometimes they were hurtful to people, and that is part of his legacy that's a little bit troubled. And it's important to name that. Like if you'll see it also in certain biographies and documentaries. People he didn't agree with, he sometimes would call them names, and kind of based on like maybe an older model of thinking. And some people felt that was insensitive and they were hurt by it. So I just want to name that. But nevertheless, in terms of his halacha and how he dealt with law and when he wasn't joking and making those statements, he was one of the more sensitive halachic decisors, and he took real life emotions and situations into account. So a few of them, which I want to mention, let me just see, someone added something in the chat section. Yeah, wasn't polygamy allowed longer in the Sephardic community? Yeah, polygamy was allowed longer in the Sephardic community. I don't know the exact history of that, but that is true, and in Yemenite community even more. So I also mentioned a few of his halachas. Okay, so we talked about agunas. So Rabbi Ovadia Yosef in 1973, after the war, there were many women who were left. Their husbands went to war and they didn't come back, and they didn't know for sure if those husbands had died in the war or not. All the women knew that they were married to them halachically, but their husbands didn't come back from war, and so they were considered agunot. We showed the picture of like the chain. They were chained. They were chained to their husband's previous status of being married to him, and they could no longer get a get because he wasn't around, and they could no longer get remarried because they didn't have proof that he was alive or dead. They had proof that he was dead. So all these people came to Rav Ovadia Yosef to try to solve this issue. Rav Ovadia Yosef took a list of around 1,000 women who were agunot at that time, and he freed all the agunot, freed them. What does that mean? He found halachic ways to enable them to remarry. That takes a brave rabbi with broad shoulders to do that. And he brought creative ways. He stayed up late at night to try to solve these agunot situations. and each one he solved in a creative way. There was one case where he actually he himself had surgery one day, and he put off the surgery so he could finish up a tshuva, enabling a woman to get remarried and to be free from her laguna status, because he was afraid that if the surgery didn't go well, he might pass and she wouldn't be freed. So he pushed off the surgery for like a few hours in order to do that. He was a brave man, and he took their situation into consideration, and very sensitive. Also, let's name a few more. We're going to talk about this later on. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was responsible for enabling 80,000 or more Ethiopians to be integrated into Israeli society. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef found sources within Jewish law that defined the Ethiopian community as halachic Jews. Nobody was willing to do that, from what I know, to the extent that Rabbi Ovadia Yosef did. And when Rabbi Ovadia Yosef established that, it got established within the land of Israel, and he is responsible for their integration into society. Now, when it comes to politics, he said at a certain point he wasn't against land for peace. Later in his life, he kind of felt it was not going to be fruitful. But earlier he said, if it means that Am Yisrael is going to be endangered unless we give over land, he was open to that. And he was in certain governments where they negotiate on those topics. So he wasn't kind of flexible in that sense, at least in his earlier years. He talked about cosmetic surgery. He allowed women who wanted to have cosmetic surgery, look better for their husbands or for shidduchim, to do that. And one more piece is brain death. So he was one of the rabbis who defined death not as cardiac or pulmonary death, but as brain death. And through that, it's a much longer conversation, but through that, people were able to better donate their organs to other people and save more lives. So that's just a few examples of Ovadia Yosef's, the topics that he talked about. But really, there's not a topic he didn't write about, a lot of times very creatively. And if you read his tshuvas, his responsa, you'll see that he brings dozens and dozens of texts. And this is before Google. Sometimes today rabbis will write tshuvas and they'll just go on Google and find different rabbis who say certain things. They'll cut and paste. Ovadia Yosef did it before Google. He was the Google. He was good. I would suppose if you had some sort of like competition, him and Google, I don't know. Maybe he will win. I don't know. Anyway, so that's a little bit on his history, him as a political leader, his biography, his political leader as a brave posek, and his connection to the masses. And there's my alarm. So with that, I'm going to head out and just bid you farewell and thank you for joining me on this journey of learning a little bit more about Sephardic Jewry. Next week the week after, we're gonna move on to Ethiopian Jewry, which I'm really excited about. I know I'm excited about all this stuff, but I have one of my rabbi friends is one of the leaders in the Ethiopian community. It's fascinating, their history and their law and how he's trying to make it work for them within Eretz Israel. So there's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot to talk about their traditions and the beauty of their culture. So join me for that. I wish you a beautiful day and only good things.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.